Synapse. My name is Serene Feng.
My name is Shreya Velagala.
And today we are excited to have very special guests on the show who will be talking with us about artificial intelligence. Kathleen, Walch, and Ron Schmelzer. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, Kathleen. Hi, Ron. So Kathleen's Walch and Ron Schmelzer are principal analysts from Cognilytica, an AI-focused research firm. And they host another podcast called the AI Today podcast, where they talk about the economics of AI and its practical applications in the present world. And Kathleen and Walch, to start off our interview, can you explain your background and how you got interested in AI?
Sure. So I'm Kathleen Walch. I'm managing partner and principal analyst at Cognilytica, and my background was actually focused around marketing. I worked at a large marketing firm for a number of years, and then my husband and I had a startup, and that's actually where I met Ron through that as well when we were out at an event. My startup folded, and I moved on to Tech Breakfast with Ron, which was actually a national morning demo-style event presenting on various technologies. We ran it in 11 locations across the country. From there, in around 2016, we really started to see a lot of demos around conversational platforms, including Alexa and Google Home, things like that. And so that's when a deep interest in AI started. And then from there, we said, wow, things are really starting to pick up in the AI space. So we created Cognilytica, which is an AI-focused research, advisory, and education firm. So we have been focused pretty heavily in AI for a few years now. And then before that, we had interest in it, but very heavily focused for the past few years.
My experience with AI actually goes pretty far back. I went to MIT, was there in the sort of mid-90s into later part of the 90s, and my academic advisor was Rodney Brooks, who is one of the sort of luminaries in robotics in the field of AI. And I always had an interest in AI. I took classes with Marvin Minsky when he was still around, and read, the Society of Mind and all that good stuff. And I ended up in the computer science master's. My degree was in computer science and engineering, actually a bachelor's degree there, and got a later an MBA. And didn't do much with AI. The funny thing is I didn't really do much with AI after I started a startup company, and that company actually grew pretty large and was acquired, and then started an analyst firm, and that grew, and that was acquired, and then started Tech Breakfast when I was trying to start my next software company with Kathleen. And sort of soon after that, while we were doing Tech Breakfast, we realized that, we were seeing the winds for artificial intelligence were heating up again. As you know, AI sort of comes and goes in these waves. And so we're now in this wave of excitement, and like about 2016 and 2017, when it really started getting heated up, Kathleen and I just saw the opportunity. We're like, okay, well, I had some background in artificial intelligence, both through MIT and just through being part of the tech ecosystem. We decided to jump in, and we spent a lot of time doing research and insight, and now we spend a lot of our time providing advisory and guidance to our clients in public sector and private sector organizations.
That's really cool. So, in your opinions, what do you guys think is the definition of AI?
So that's a really interesting question because there's no commonly accepted definition of AI. So many people have many different, variations of the definition.
Yeah, and I think so. So the way that it's commonly referred to, artificial intelligence, is machine activities and functions that approximate the behavior and functions of human beings, right? So you think about what humans can do with our cognitive ability, the ability to perceive the world around us, the ability to plan for the future, the ability to predict what's going to happen. That's usually when autonomous manufacturers are thinking about all those things, are like predict, plan, and perceive. But, there's a whole lot of things that we do that are really quite miraculous. We can understand all sorts of unstructured information, images and video, and the world, our senses can have communication with each other, can make decisions and predict the future. We can obviously walk and talk and think and do all these things at the same time and adapt to the world around us. And that's really what we want. We want machines to be able to do those things. And it's the collection of those things that makes artificial intelligence. The challenge, of course, is that as soon as you do one of those things, like, oh, machines can read text, now you're like, well, this is no longer AI. Now you're like, this is just advanced computing. And so that's why the bar for AI keeps moving. And in all the AI luminaries, including the people who have created AI, the 1956, the Dartmouth Conference on AI, they actually did not establish a very well-defined meaning for AI. So everybody's been kind of working in this space and it's a collection of all sorts of sciences that are making AI work.
I mean, do you think that like AI has any relation to like human intelligence, or it's like based on human intelligence?
Well,
yeah, absolutely. So that's, I think the goal is to get it to almost human intelligence. What makes it hard is that we have no agreed upon definition of intelligence as well. So everybody has their different opinions on that. But yes, I think that, the goal of artificial intelligence is to mimic that of the brain and mimic intelligence of humans and living beings.
Right. And I think, to Kathleen's point about are we trying to approach human intelligence, or how does this relate to the idea of human intelligence? AI actually is older than computing itself, like modern computing. You go back to, who created a lot of the fundamental ideas of the programmable computer, Turing, with the Turing machine, just the whole idea of that whole framework, the von Neumann machines, all that. That's 1950s computing. But also Alan Turing, who created the basis for computing, was also the progenitor of a lot of the ideas of AI. He came up with the Turing test. So, we originally thought we could build computers that would be similar to the human brain. We built these artificial neurons because we were trying to simulate the way the brain works. Like, what's crazy that the brain can work so well, given it's just a bunch of, neurons firing impulses. How can we achieve this intelligence out of this crazy chaotic mess? And so I think AI takes a lot of inspiration from human intelligence, and we try to understand it. I think that's sort of the overlap between neuroscience and AI, is just trying to understand just like how the brain works and try to represent it in a machine.
Yeah. So since you're talking about intelligence, and you guys spoke a lot about automation and AI in a lot of your podcasts. So what do you guys think is the difference between automation and AI?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we say that automation and AI are not interchangeable. They're not the same thing. Automation is where you're taking a repetitive task that's the same every time, and you're having a machine do it. So it's incredibly useful, but it's not intelligence. So if you think about a robotic arm that was programmed to pick something up and put it in a spot every single time, it's able to do that job very well and, can bring about a lot of efficiencies, but it is not able to perceive the world around it and adapt to change, so that if a human gets in its way or if the object is not there, it will still try and pick it up and move it. Intelligence and AI, on the other hand, if you had intelligence in that robotic arm, it would be able to sense that a human or an object was in its way, and it would stop. It would not actually try and pick it up. So that's the difference between automation and AI, that, automation is just repeating the same task over and over again, but AI is where it's actually bringing in more intelligent features to whatever process it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the reason why a lot of people like to talk about automation and intelligence together is because you look at these things that machines are able to do, and you're like, wow, the more that these machines are capable, the more value they bring, and you want to add intelligence to these autonomous machines. Or sometimes they're so good at their automation, you almost think that they're intelligent. You're like, wow. Mm-hmm. That Chuck E. Cheese robot is just like, I can talk to that thing all day, but it's just, it's just automation, right? There's no intelligence, there's no brain there, there's nothing there that's actually perceiving or anything you're doing. But I think this is where the gap is between automation. As Kathleen says, you can program a robotic arm to do a repetitive task, but what if something gets in the way? What if the object changes its shape? What if there's some new thing that you need to do? Well, a robotic arm that's been automated will fail because it won't know how to do that thing. But a robotic arm with intelligence will understand, okay, this part flipped over, I should, tip it up, or there's this obstruction in the way, I should go around it, or this task has changed, but it's basically the same task, so I don't need to be stopping and start, So people want to apply intelligence to automation because it increases the overall productivity and efficiency of those things without someone having to stop and reprogram everything from scratch.
Okay, so for autonomous cars, would you say it's kind of programmed, but also the intelligence part added to the cars for them to have their own brain?
Well, that's certainly part of what we want. With autonomous vehicles, you literally just want to get in the car, tell it where to go, and close your eyes, or watch a movie, or talk to your friends, and never pay attention to the road again. So, autonomous vehicles need to be able to do everything that a human driver could do, which is, navigate and deal with obstacles, not drive off the road, handle weather and all that sort of stuff. And of course, actually, it turns out that's very, very, very difficult. Autonomous, we don't really have, there's like 6 levels of autonomy from level 0 to level 5.
Yeah.
And the best we have right now in terms of commercial vehicles is we're around maybe a level 3, maybe. So it's
for at least commercially, available vehicles, not special prototypes that companies have created that aren't for commercial sale.
Yeah,
but I
believe like the Tesla is Model 3, or like is in level 3 right now.
Yeah, Tesla's Model 3, and I think Cadillac Super Cruise is level 3, and that's about all that's currently considered level 3 autonomy.
So we've listened to a lot of your episodes, and you always conclude with the question, what do you think is the future of AI in regards to corporations and beyond? So how would you answer this question?
We always ask this question because it's a way of like asking the guests to put on their little crystal ball, their wizard's hat, kind of look out to the future and kind of see where things go. And we are continuing to be sort of impressed in the ways that people are applying AI to their real world problems right now, in a lot of, I would say, even mundane ways. And so people think of AI and maybe they have this science fiction perception that AI is like, C-3PO or Terminator or some, fanciful robot that can do everything, Jetsons robot, Wall-E, whatever. They have these things in their mind. But of course, when we talk about AI, we talk about the 7 patterns of AI, which is that it's like, well, yeah, you could talk about AI, which is not really very well defined, as we just started this podcast talking about, and maybe we're all talking about different things. So let's actually be a little more specific, knock it down one level. And we talk about the 7 patterns of AI. So the 7 patterns are, systems that can do recognition, conversational systems, patterns and anomalies, find those patterns and detect anomalies, predictive analytics, and help us make better decisions, autonomous systems, hyper-personalization, which is trying to build profiles of the individual, goal-driven systems, so having systems that can basically find their solution through the maze. And I think that's all of it. So recognition, conversation, patterns, predictions, hyper-personalization, goal-driven systems, and autonomous. So those are the patterns we're seeing. And in each one of those patterns, there's a remarkably broad set of implementations. People are implementing things all over the place. It'll actually be almost impossible in the next few years to even walk out the door and not interact with an AI-enabled system of some sort in one of those patterns, whether it's facial recognition systems to conversational systems to autonomous systems. That's kind of what gets us excited, and that's really what AI today is all about, which is basically trying to find those implementations of what's happening with AI today, not talking too far in the future, and then showcasing those things so that our listeners can really understand that AI really is here today. It's not the promise of tomorrow.
Yeah, that's great to bring up, and we always like to look at AI within those 7 patterns because I think it helps really break down what it is you're trying to solve. And so where do we think, or at least me personally, think the future of AI is in general, is that it's going to be incorporated into our everyday lives that make our lives easier without us knowing it. It's going to help make things, frictionless, and we're interacting with AI daily. So we use it to unlock our phones, or we'll use it to help navigate us from point A to point B. We'll be able to set reminders using only our voice and do search with only our voice. And, like Ron had brought up earlier, that once we're able to do it, people no longer consider it AI. And I think that technology is moving so fast, and adoption has been moving fast as well, that we are going to just continue to see AI integrated into every single part of our daily lives. And it's just going to continue to make things hopefully easier. I also like to think about this question as, what am I most excited for with AI? Mm-hmm. And I have to say, hands down, I am most excited for fully autonomous vehicles.
Yeah.
So I no longer have to drive again.
Yeah, definitely. So I have some questions from our listeners, and I know a lot of people, they are afraid of what AI brings in the future, and a lot of people think that AI is going to replace some of our jobs, especially ones that require thought, and it's not necessarily just automation replacing jobs. But how would you address those fears? Is it just something that is going to be overcome, like something that just like the fears, are they just temporary, or do you think these are really legitimate fears that we really need to go over?
So that's a great question, because I think that people always have fear when there's new technology and there's disruption. It's just inevitable. It's human nature. So it's, we're in Industry 4.0, back in Industry 1.0, and then when we brought in factories, we brought in computers, and then with every single big technology wave, mobile, internet, big data, they've been disruptive. And so people always fear that they're going to lose their jobs. But if you look at the data is showing that people are not actually losing their jobs because of AI. They are just able to do their jobs better. They're not actually, being replaced. Now, you can argue, well, certain positions may go away. And so what we always say is, well, AI is not a job killer, but it's a job category killer. So that the secretaries of the 1960s are now, we don't have rooms full of secretaries anymore, but we have database administrators and we have social media marketers and roles that didn't exist back in the 1960s. We haven't lost employment because of that.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's kind of interesting about the job. AI is not a job killer; it's a category killer. It's actually something that we've written about. You may see Forbes article about that, some other articles that we've written with basically that exact title. Is that it's funny, especially when you're talking about automation, because automation is not necessarily AI, right? There's a lot of forms of automation that are just repeating the same thing over and over again. And there's a big movement in sort of associated with AI, although it's not AI, called robotic process automation, which is this movement towards using software bots to automate a lot of the software tasks that people would have to do, like a lot of menial, sort of computer-oriented tasks, cutting and pasting and entering in data and all that sort of stuff. And, the big fear there is like, well, wait a second, there's like tons of people doing this sort of administrative office work. You might think that all of these people would be out of jobs, but it turns out that there's a difference between job and work. And sometimes we say, oh, jobs are work, but actually, no, you have a job and what you do is work. And a lot of these tasks actually take away the work, not necessarily the job, because what's going to happen is once the employer knows that you're not doing that one thing that takes 80% of your time, but only delivers 20% of their value, give that to the bot, and then the rest of your time can be spent delivering value. And that's the automation paradox that Kathleen was referencing about the data not supporting job loss. Of all companies, Amazon has invested the most in automation, in AI, and all that stuff. You just look at an Amazon fulfillment center. There's like robots pushing around these fulfillment stacks. There's like tons of automation there, right? But Amazon has actually hired more workers in their various fulfillment shops since they've added automation than they did before. They went from like 85,000 to 122 something thousand jobs, and they're increasing because what they decide is that, like, hey, if it's easier now for us to open up these fulfillment centers because we don't have to staff so many people, we're just going to open up more fulfillment centers and we're going to deliver products in 1 hour instead of 1 day. And that's the kind of change that, when you look at a firm that's like the traditional retailer that has a traditional warehouse, the jobs are going to be lost not because that warehouse is going to move to automation. Those jobs would be lost because companies like Amazon are using advanced technology and making these older warehouses more obsolete. And this is I think the big thing we tell people is that AI is enabling transformative change, and so it's going to change the nature of work, and organizations need to get in front of it and basically realize, well, what can you do if you have access to machines that can perceive the world around them, do predictive change and all the other, have conversations and all the sorts of stuff that we talk about.
That's very interesting that you brought up the point that AI is going to transform the face of work and how people do work, and maybe even what kind of work people do, because they're using AI to do part of the repetitive things that we've been doing for a long time. So it looks like in the future, there's a new set of skills that people need to have in order to work well with AI. So what would you suggest people work on right now so that they can best work with AI in the future?
So I think that, that's kind of, you can look at this as two different sides. So if you want to work with AI, meaning you want to help build models, things like that, we definitely see a need for data scientists, because many companies want to do AI, but they don't have the skill set to do it. And so we see a shortage of people who are trained data scientists who can do this. So I think that that's, one skill that people can have so that you're able to actually build models and look at the data and do things. On the flip side, if you're going to work with it as kind of a companion or a coworker, we call it augmented intelligence, where it's not replacing the human, but it's just helping you do your job better. I'm not necessarily sure that you need skills for that, any different skills than what your trade would have. I think that people just need to be more open-minded in working with them and say, this is really going to be a companion to what I do. And I shouldn't feel threatened that this is actually going to replace my work, but it's just going to help me do my job better.
Exactly. One of the interesting things that we are noticing is that, we've been in this information age, as you call it, the information age, since like the 60s and 70s, right? Ever since computers became practical for companies and individuals to own, we've been in this information age. And then maybe in the last 20 so years, we're sort of in this connected age, like the internet and mobile devices have made us increasingly connected, right? We all are getting the sense now we're actually moving to the data age. And that's kind of weird because wait a second, data is involved in the information age and the connected age. But we're moving to this point where people are like, the information's there and we're connected. But the power is actually in the data, and people are becoming much more aware of and sensitive to issues of data. 15 years ago, if you asked a random person, about when Facebook just came out, about their concerns about Facebook, they'd be like, what concerns are you talking about? Well, aren't you concerned about privacy? They'd be like, they'd have no idea what you're talking about. There's so much awareness now that that Facebook is actually not really a social media platform, it's a data platform. There's so much awareness of data privacy. There's awareness, and then on the flip side, there's awareness of the value of data. People are saying, yes, I know I have databases and I have, huge, data stores, petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes of data. The problem I have is making sense of all that data. How do I wrangle this data? And now people are aware of data cleansing and data quality, and they're aware of the need to do data labeling. And so I think we're shifting into this ecosystem where it used to be from the 1960s and 70s through maybe the early parts of this last decade that the CIO was basically the most important technology person in every organization. We are moving to an era where the CDO, the Chief Data Officer, may actually end up becoming much more important than the CIO. The CIO keeps the systems running, makes sure the network doesn't go down, that the software and the computers are not collapsing, but it's the Chief Data Officer who's actually getting the value from all that IT. And I think that is a fundamental shift that we're definitely keeping an eye on.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting that you brought up that people, normal consumers, are aware of how their data, or they're trying to be more aware of how their data is being used. And they're trying to gain more control over how their data is being used in machine learning or AI. And there's a lot of people who've been proposing legislation in regards to AI. So what kind of regulations do you think are going to come up in the future?
Yeah, that's a question that we always ask ourselves, and we ask, people in the industry. It's hard to say exactly what laws are going to come about because you don't know exactly some of the consequences that need to be regulated. I mean, in general, we're seeing laws around data and privacy. I think that there will be laws around, maybe conversational systems. Do they need to identify themselves as a bot so that people know up front that they're talking to an AI system and they're not talking to a human? There'll be, questions and concerns around things like that. Maybe ethical use of AI and, what you need to disclose and not disclose. Maybe the usage of data for training models. It's hard to say. I always like to bring up the use case of cell phones. And back when, cell phones first started to really make their way into everyday life, people would talk on their cell phones, hold it up to their ear, drive, be totally distracted. And it took quite some time for laws to catch up because I think that people and lawmakers and society really needed to see, how are mobile phones impacting the way I drive, and is it really a distraction? And we said, yes, it is. And so we came up with laws and regulations to govern the use of cell phones in cars. And I think that this is going to be very similar where, there's some obvious things that we can say, okay, okay, I think it might be focused on here. But then there's some not so obvious things that only time will tell how laws and regulations need to be changed and shaped for our usage of AI.
That's right. There's actually one of the things we track. So one of the things we do when we're not doing AI today, which is actually something we started at the very, very beginning of our company, Cognilytica, which is a research and advisory firm focused on AI, machine learning, and cognitive technologies. We actually started the AI Today podcast for two reasons: just to see what was happening out there, connect with some industry luminaries, and of course, get the word out about what we're doing. And it's been excellent. We're at 127 episodes now. It's pretty amazing. One of the things that we publish these reports, and we do about 40 some odd reports a year. We actually have a report coming out fairly soon about the regulatory landscape for artificial intelligence, and it does split out into these areas. There's a whole bunch of rules that have to do with data privacy, data sharing. About GDPR, the regulation out of the European Union, General Data Privacy Regulation. California has one that's now active. It's the California Consumer Privacy Act, I think. There's a whole bunch, and it does impact AI because the thing that's basically fueling AI's growth is data. You can't do anything without the data. But there's lots of other questions. People are wondering about the use of facial recognition, especially for policing or just facial recognition. Do you want to walk down the street and have a camera that knows exactly who you are? It kind of creeps people out. So, what about autonomous vehicles? I mean, as Kathleen mentioned, what happens if an autonomous vehicle runs over somebody? Like, who's at fault? Is it the person that's inside the car? They just stepped in. It wasn't their car. The car did it by, So, but we don't have laws that say what happens if a car without a driver runs somebody over. Whose fault is it? So, this is part of that. The unintended, unknown consequences. We're worried about. The safety of our elections. We're worried about cybersecurity risks. We're worried about so many things, and it's possible AI could play a role in all of those things. So it's good to be thinking about it.
Yeah, like when you were talking about all of these ethical issues that could arise from AI, it kind of makes me think about how for humans, emotion is something that prevents us from having as many ethical problems in terms of technology. But do you think adding emotional intelligence into AI could be a benefit?
Machines should be able to understand or can be made to understand human sentiment, human emotions, right? Sometimes people say emotional intelligence, and what they mean is that somebody who's able to understand somebody else's thought or somebody else's feelings, be sympathetic or empathetic and say, oh, okay, they can sense when you're frustrated. They know when you're happy. They know when you're confused. Any of those feelings, people who have good EI. It's funny because some people are good at emotional intelligence, some people aren't. So trying to get machines is kind of intriguing. But that's useful because if I know if you're talking to a computer system and you're getting frustrated, a human might be able to oh, this person's not happy. A machine will just be like, I don't understand that question. Please repeat it one more time. So emotional intelligence is really helpful from that perspective. As far as machines having emotions, well. That may be far out in the future. I don't know.
Yeah, and are they artificial emotions? It actually, for the past 2 years, we have done a voice assistant benchmark, and so we tested on various things. And so one of it is, common sense and reasoning and emotional IQ. Can it understand that? And right now they are failing. They're not doing very well. They still have a long way to go, and I think everybody is cognizant of that there are limitations right now. But bringing in emotional IQ, that's something that you need to be very mindful of, especially if, are you going to disclose that you're talking to a AI system and not a human?
Thank you, Ron and Kathleen, for coming on our podcast and giving us a detailed overview of AI. Are there any final notes that you would like to leave our listener with about AI and how we can best equip and prepare ourselves for the future?
I think just to continue to see what is getting released. This technology and applications are changing daily, and companies are constantly coming out with new products. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and we're very excited to continue to see where this goes, but we always want to make sure that people do not get overhyped and that the community as a whole overpromises and underdelivers on what they can actually do. So we want to make sure that expectations and there's some level setting, because while these systems are able to do some really incredible things, they're still nowhere near, human level intelligence. And so just know the limitations of what they can and cannot do, use them for good, and we're really excited to see where AI continues to go in the coming years.
That's right. I think that's a good way to end. And I would say for those who are listening, definitely subscribe and listen to our AI Today podcast. That's on iTunes and Spotify and Google Play and Stitcher, all those places. Kathleen and I also write for Forbes, so you can catch us on the Cognitive World channel. I don't know what they call it. There's a Cognitive World group on Forbes where we write about AI and track all these stuff. We also write for Tech Target on many of these use cases. And of course, follow our research. If you go to Cognilytica.com, which is Cognilytica.com, you'll see, of course, all of our infographics and podcasts, but of course, all of our research that we do. We conduct lots of research there, and you can stay in tune with all that. So we really appreciate participating in your podcast, and hopefully this will continue to 100 and plus episodes before you know it.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen and Ron.
And that is it for today's episode. Kathleen Walch and Ron Schmelzer were our guests. They are Principal AI Analysts at Cognilytica, and they also host their own podcast called AI Today, which we've included more details in the show notes. Thank you for listening to The Synapse.